Well, there we are. Patrick Maguire. Here we go. PMQs Unpacked is next here on Times Radio. We'll go live to the House of Commons and pause the action in real time as Keir Starmer faces Boris Johnson across the dispatch box. Go online. The cameras are on. You can watch along, listen along. PMQs Unpacked is next here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It's 12 o'clock. I'm Matt Chorley. This is Times Radio. PMQs Unpacked is next. First, a look at the headlines this lunchtime. And the Bury South MP, Christian Wakeford, has defected from the Conservatives to Labour. He's reportedly told Boris Johnson that you and the Conservative Party as a whole have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves. So it's the scene for an extraordinary PMQs. Meanwhile, at least 10 Tory MPs who were elected in 2019 are understood to have submitted their letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister this morning. Pressure growing on Boris Johnson and his future as PM following a series of allegations about parties held in number 10 during COVID lockdowns. He'll be up in the dispatch box very, very shortly. In other news, police in Ireland investigating the death of 23-year-old teacher Aisling Murphy in County Offaly have arrested a second man. He was detained in the east of Ireland and has been questioned in relation to the potential withholding of information. Another man was arrested yesterday on suspicion of murder. And the Ministry of Defence has announced that armed forces personnel will receive the existing Operational Service Medal Afghanistan, featuring a new class breeding Operation Pitting. It's to recognise their contributions to the evacuation from Afghanistan of Afghan and British nationals last August when the Taliban took control of the country. We'll bring you a full news update as and when we can, but now it's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Order, order. I call Matt Chorley and Patrick Maguire.
Yes, we are live on Times Radio, live on the Times Radio YouTube channel for PMQs Unpacked. Patrick Maguire, Times Red Box editor, is here.
Primed and ready for one of the historic instalments, perhaps Boris Johnson's last instalment. Well, it won't be, even if he has to resign as Conservative Party leader. But God, how do you play this if you're Boris Johnson?
It seemed huge last week that we were expecting this apology for the parties that had gone in Downing Street. But to have someone resign, a Conservative MP resign and defect directly to the opposition, not to your Lib Dems or any of that nonsense, straight to the opposition. Christian Wakeford, the MP for Bury South. Is this the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson, do you think? And we don't want to get too caught up in the hyperbole, obviously, but this feels like a huge moment.
It is a huge moment because if you compare the last direct Labour to Tory to Labour defections, Sean Woodward in 2001, discontented with William Hague's direction of travel on stuff like gay marriage, etc. Quentin Davis in 2008, an MP everybody has forgotten, but he went to sort of give a positive endorsement of Gordon Brown. They were people joining a government that was sort of in its imperial phase. This is an MP saying, one, the Labour Party is sufficiently detoxified in the north, and particularly on anti-Semitism. Don't forget, Bury South has a big Jewish population. And B, that Boris Johnson, he has a 420 majority. That is the bottom line here. He no longer has faith that Boris Johnson is an election winner.
And that's such an about turn, because that was his appeal. That, for all of his faults, of which we discussed them many times, he won elections. He was popular. Well, PMQs has begun. They've just had a question from the Conservative MP John Bowen, which seemed to be trying to make Britain more attractive to young people, which I'm not sure is necessarily where the national debate is. If you want to watch along, you can join us on YouTube. We've got more than 1,000 people already, so it's already more popular than last week. Go on to YouTube, search Times Radio. You can watch along. This extraordinary Prime Minister's questions. What can Boris Johnson do? He's already facing MPs calling for a vote of no confidence. He's had one of his own MPs announce that they are defecting to the Labour Party. And Bury South is one of those seats which was so crucial to the tumbling of the Red Wall. He only won it by 400 seats. There are plenty of other Conservative MPs in exactly this position, aren't there, Patrick Maguire?
Yes, exactly. With slender majorities in traditional Labour seats or marginals that the Conservative Party won convincingly or otherwise in 2019. And if nothing else, this is a reminder that Boris Johnson's party management isn't very good. I've just been told by a 29 intake MP, Christian Wakeford, was sat in a room with his colleagues from their intake this morning and said nothing. The whips clearly weren't entirely across this, and the upshot is Boris Johnson is going to be humiliated. Christian Wakeford is sat behind Keir Starmer, right in Boris Johnson's eye line. It couldn't be worse.
Here we go then. Question number 1, PMQs Unpacked. Watch along on the Times Radio YouTube channel. This is a very, very gleeful Keir Starmer.
Position, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming... Can I start...
Listen to the Prime Minister.
Can I just say, I expect people to listen to the Prime Minister. I certainly don't want the Leader of the Opposition shouted down. You might not like the day, but this is the day that we've got. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not bothered. I assumed it was directed over here. Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Lindsay Hoyle taking no nonsense today.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Applause in the House of Commons there for Keir Starmer's not entirely unprepared gag.
Order. Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long
Even
day.
Lindsay Hoyle's laughing at that.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next he said he was sickened and furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week, he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the rules, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
There we go then, Boris Johnson's response.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he talks about the rules, and let me repeat what I said to the honourable lady across the aisle earlier on. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. But I renew what I've said, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to his view,
Nobody believes what you say. Can we have a little less? I want to this Prime Minister like I wanted to Leader of the Opposition. I want the same courtesy from both sides. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we'd listened to the right honourable gentleman about COVID restrictions, which is the substance of his question, then, Mr. Speaker, we would still be, we would have been in lockdown after July. If this is the truth, if we listened to the Labour front bench in the run-up to Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, we would have stayed in restrictions with huge damage to the economy. And it's because of the judgments that I've taken and that we have taken in Downing Street that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and GDP, Mr. Speaker, now back up above pre-pandemic levels. And as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say this, right honourable gentleman, the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
There we are. That was Boris Johnson. If you agree with the Prime Minister about whether or not the Tories can win back Bury South, there's a poll right now on our YouTube channel. We're up to 1,500 people already. Can we get to 2,000?
It didn't sound like he was going to acknowledge Christian Wakeford till the very end there. And interestingly, I thought he was going to say he didn't sound strong enough to demand he fight a by-election. That would be the ultimate test for a leader who was truly confident he could win Bury South.
And his idea of generations, it was 1997 that the Labour Party won Bury South. It was Conservative before that. It's not that long ago. I mean, we should point out Christian Wakeford sitting behind Keir Starmer wearing a Union Jack face mask, just to really hammer home the...
Well, as Keir Starmer said, the Labour Party has changed. One, and I think most importantly in this case, detoxifying the party's reputation for anti-Semitism. But two, that a Tory MP can defect directly to the Labour Party and sit behind the leader in a Union Jack face mask suggests that Keir Starmer's efforts to rebrand and reposition the party, tedious though it is for us to listen to and to watch him wrap himself in the flag, is having an effect.
It works. And but we don't need to pick over all of Boris Johnson's answers. This stuff about how we would still be in lockdown, I think has been dealt with repeatedly by the Labour Party. They didn't call for a lockdown in December.
And indeed, if we were still in lockdown, Boris Johnson would still be having a great time anyway. So
he doesn't. That's why he doesn't know whether or not we're in lockdown or not. Just saying, I renew what I said, and I think we had the first Sue Gray mention, which we'll keep across. Right, we've got a lot to get through. They're going to be as long as that. We're going to be here till about mid-afternoon. Let's go back. This is only question 2 from Keir Starmer.
Look, it's important I want to hear both sides, and I don't want this continuous chant, because if we do, there'll be less people on these benches, and the same on the other side.
That's Lindsay Hall
I
ticking
expect
off the
both sides
Conservative
to be heard
side.
with courtesy. Keir Starmer.
Bury South is now a Labour seat, Prime Minister.
Sorry. Order. Did somebody want me to apologise? No, somebody shouted apologise. I hope it wasn't aimed at me. No. And so we'll also have less from that corner, Keir Starmer.
That's Lindsay Hall pointing to the sort of far end of the Conservative benches.
Not only did he write the rules, but some of his staff say they did warn him about attending the party on the 20th of May 2020. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It's almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it.
Boris Johnson obviously often mocks Keir Starmer for being a lawyer.
So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to Right Honourable Gentleman for repeating the question that he's already asked. We have answered, Mr. Speaker, that it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and we have more people in employment and more employees on the payroll now than there were before the pandemic began. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of them.
OK, let's pause it there. Patrick Maguire, Times Red Box editor. There are hundreds of people watching along on the YouTube channel. Do join us on the Times Radio YouTube channel, because it's worth watching this as well as being able to hear it. Lindsay Hoyle speaking for almost as much as the other two.
Yeah, I feel that by the end of this session I might have got out my Lindsay Hoyle impersonation, but it's too early for that. I think that was a ridiculous Nadine Dorries defence from Boris Johnson there, which just shows you how deep the mire he finds himself is in. It's almost word for word identical to the quote from Nadine Dorries. his biggest cheerleader in the cabinet, perhaps only cheerleader, talking about boosters, etc. And more importantly, it's not an answer to the question that Keir Starmer asked, which is one he can't answer without incriminating himself. And that's why it sounds so ridiculous. It's the only answer he can give.
Let's take a look at some of the comments that people are posting on YouTube. Somebody says, I'm just waiting for Johnson to blame the Labour government. Answer the bloody question, says David. Valerie says, Boris is flailing a bit, I think. Same old, same old. I don't think I can watch. No, don't say that. Somebody else. Boris is quickly catching up with Trump in the line stakes, says Richard. More drivel. Oh, it's too painful. I think Matt is going to wear that bell out. There we are, for every time he mentions the Inquiry, which he thinks is going to get him out of everything. Do go online and share your views. Go to YouTube and search Times Radio, and you can watch along. Keir Starmer trying a lawyer's question. When did you first become aware of concerns about the party? Boris Johnson ended up talking about how we're the most open economy in Europe. Let's see if Keir Starmer has any more luck with what is only his third question.
Keir Starmer.
So, Mr Speaker, apparently Sue Gray is going to tell the Prime Minister when he first became aware that his staff had concerns about the May 20th. The Prime Minister's account gets more extraordinary with each version of his defence. If the Prime Minister's new defence were true, it requires him to suggest that his staff are not being truthful when they say they warned him about the party. It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Mr Speaker, I've said what I've said about the events in Number 10. He will have to wait for the report. And Mr Speaker, I think he asks for further clarification. I think there are lots of people who are interested. I say this entirely in passing, Mr Speaker. Lots of people are interested in the exact legal justification from the learned leader of the opposition for the picture of him drinking a pint of beer or a bottle of beer. Mr Speaker, I merely, perhaps he could tell the House about that in a minute, Mr Speaker. But what I can,
literally laughing at Boris Johnson's face there,
is that throughout the pandemic, people across government have been working flat out to protect the British public.
Flat out on the sofas.
With huge quantities of PPE, so we can now make 80% in this country, with the biggest and most generous furlough scheme virtually anywhere in the world, and the fastest. And by the way, Mr Speaker, if we listened to them, we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have been able to deliver the vaccine rollout at the speed that we did.
I would say drink, but the suitcase is empty. Let's just jump in there, Patrick Maguire. If you are just joining us in the middle of PMQs Unpacked and you haven't heard the news, minutes before PMQs got underway, the Conservative MP, Christian Wakeford, defected from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. He's sitting behind Keir Starmer, wearing a Union Jack face mask. Should point out that sitting next to Boris Johnson today is Rishi Sunak. He went missing last week. He went all the way to Ilfracombe.
Liz Truss has returned the favour there by flying to Australia.
By flying to Australia. Where's the furthest? How can I get away as far away from this as possible? I mean, we're now sort of in the point where they're not really. Keir Starmer's not really asking questions, and Boris Johnson's not really answering them.
I've seen it all. Keir Starmer laughing at a dispatch box and looking like he's having a good time. This, again, is an illustration of how far Boris Johnson's fallen. What I think is interesting, if you compare this to Boris Johnson's first public appearance yesterday in that interview with Beth Rigby, did his best to seem contrite, almost an impression of a man who was capable of feeling shame and remorse. But now, it's like now someone's put 50p in the back of their Boris Johnson doll, and he's trotting out all the best lines. It's as a gambit for regaining the confidence of MPs like Christian Wakeford, the ones who are still in the party. I'm pretty doubtful it's advisable, to be honest with you.
I have to say, last week when we did this, the comments were not quite 50-50, but there were people trying to defend Boris Johnson. I can't see any right now so far. Everyone's saying there's just lots of waffle. Gary says Boris is not having a good day. Somebody says, where's Keir Starmer going with this? If every question is going to be deflected by Boris as a wait for Sue Gray, and then used to reel off the greatest hits, says Sachin. But I suppose he's got to ask something. Anyway, we'll see how we're going to go on. I mean, it's another sort of three-way triangulated PMQs between Boris Johnson, Keir Starmer and Lindsay Hoyle. Let's go back to the comments.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister thinks the only accusation he faces that he once had a beer with a takeaway, then Operation Save Big Dog is in deeper trouble than I thought. If a Prime Minister misleads Parliament, should they resign?
So, Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The Right Honourable Gentleman is continuing to ask a series of questions which he knows will be fully addressed by the inquiry. He is wasting this House's time. He's wasting the people's time, Mr. Speaker. He continues to be completely irrelevant, Mr. Speaker, because we have an inquiry. We have an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to anticipate that inquiry any further. What I can tell him is that it is because of the judgments that were taken in Downing Street and because of the willingness of the British people to put trust, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in those judgments, to come forward in huge numbers to get vaccinated, which people did, and I thank them for it from the bottom of my heart. People did that because they listened to our messages, Mr. Speaker, and it's as a result of that that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and youth unemployment, which he ought to care about, youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, let's just jump in there. There was a reason, Patrick Maguire, that Boris Johnson's saying all this stuff is because there are some Conservative MPs, wavering Conservative MPs, for whom that might work. I got the calls right on the stuff that matters is actually, it's got some purchase on some Conservative MPs.
It does, and that was the message Michael gove when he addressed Tory MPs, the 1922 committee, this time last week, after another nightmare PMQs with Boris Johnson. He said, listen, I've had my doubts about the Prime Minister, but he gets the big calls right. Nadine Dorries said that this morning. Every Cabinet Minister, still Lords to Prime Minister, will be saying that. And I do wonder, part of me wonders, I can see out the corner of my eye Tory MPs, goading Christian Wakeford across the aisle. You do wonder whether this stays the hand of some Tory MPs whose trigger fingers were getting itchy. They might write to Graham Brady. They might just be cowed into partisan loyalty for this and might be able to justify not going for Boris Johnson on the grounds that he's seen us through the pandemic.
It's interesting. Now, I mean, on the specific of the question, Keir Starmer asking if the Prime Minister leaves the House, misleads the House, should they resign? That's a sort of standing convention. If someone breaches the ministerial code, including lying to the House of Commons, then they would have to resign. But we've clearly seen breaches of the ministerial code before where that hasn't happened. Right, we go back to the House of Commons. It's question number 5 from Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Well, I know it's not going well, Prime Minister, but look on the bright side. At least the staff at number 10 know how to pack a suitcase. Mr. Speaker, last year, Her Majesty the Queen sat alone when she marked the passing of the man she'd been married to for 73 years. She followed the rules of the country that she leads. On the eve of that funeral, a suitcase was filled with booze and wheeled into Downing Street. A DJ played and staff parted late into the night. The Prime Minister has been forced to hand an apology to Her Majesty the Queen. Isn't he ashamed that he didn't hand in his resignation at the same time?
Mr. Speaker, I understand why the Right Honourable Gentleman continues to politicise issues.
Sorry, Prime Minister. We normally would not, and quite rightly, mention the royal family.
That's another convention in the House of Commons.
We don't get into discussions on the royal family.
Well, in that case, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the Right Honourable Gentleman to withdraw it.
I've dealt with it, Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, are you going to?
Oh, no. So Boris Johnson's now back at the dispatch box.
Order.
Now Lindsay Hoyle's back on his feet again.
Prime Minister, we don't want to go through that again. I'll make the decisions. The answer is that the next question, I'm going back to Keir Starmer to ask his final question. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Prime Minister wastes energy defending the indefensible. People's energy bills are rocketing. Labour has a plan to deal with it. Axe VAT for everyone, provide extra support for the hardest hit, and pay for it with a one-off tax on oil and gas companies. A serious plan for a serious problem. What's the government offering? Nothing. Too distracted by their own chaos to do their job. While Labour was setting out plans to heat homes, he was buying a fridge to keep the party wine chilled. While we were setting out plans to keep bills down, he was planning parties. And while we were setting out plans to save jobs in the steel industry, he was trying to save just one job, his own. Doesn't the country deserve so much better than this out of touch, out of control, out of ideas, and soon to be out of office Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what this government has been doing to look after the people of this country throughout this pandemic and beyond. We have been cutting the cost of living, helping them with the living wage. We've been cutting taxes for people on low pay, Mr. Speaker. We've been increasing payments for people suffering the costs of fuel.
Prime Minister, can I just say to everyone in here, our constituents wants to hear the questions and the answers. The great British public, the members of this United Kingdom which you're representing, they need to hear. Please, let's hear the questions and answers. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to look after people throughout this pandemic and beyond. But we've also, Mr. Speaker, been cutting crime by 10%, putting 11,000 more police officers already out on the street. Record home building last year, Mr. Speaker. More homes than at any time in the last 30 years. We are building 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Gigabit broadband has gone up from 9% coverage in our country to 65% already. And as I said already, I think 3 times or 4 times today, we have more people, more employees on the payroll now than before the pandemic began. And unemployment, youth unemployment, at a record low, Mr. Speaker. And when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, and the history of the Labour Party comes to be written, and believe me, they are history and will remain history, Mr. Speaker, it will show that we delivered while they dithered, and we vaccinated while they vacillated, Mr. Speaker. And the reason we've been able to lift restrictions faster than any other country in Europe, and we have the most open economy and the most open society in Europe, Mr. Speaker, is thanks to the booster rollout and thanks to the work of staff up and down Whitehall, across government, throughout the NHS, Mr. Speaker, and I am intensely proud of what this government has done.
Boris Johnson there, rounding things off with quite the greatest hits, Patrick Maguire.
Yes, nothing we haven't heard before from Boris Johnson. I was most struck, though, by a not inconsiderable cheer from behind him, suggesting that he hasn't lost his party completely, and nothing gets the hackles of Tory MPs up like a bit of red on blue. So perhaps that's his best hope.
You do wonder, it is interesting that whether or not the defection, what was now about half an hour ago, when we heard that Christian Wakeford, the Conservative MP for Bury South, had defected to the Labour Party, designed to be a big moment of drama at PMQs, but maybe, at least for this half an hour, it's galvanised some Conservative support behind Boris Johnson?
And particularly, I think 2019, we've heard a lot about the 2019 intake of Conservative MPs, who Christian Wakeford was sat with just hours ago. I wonder if it's a clarifying moment for them. As much as many of them will worry about their seats and be uncomfortable with the direction of travel under Boris Johnson, as Christian Wakeford is, I just wonder whether this might convince them which team they really are on in their heart of hearts. But at the same time, it may encourage them to think, well, God, if Boris Johnson isn't even flavour of the month in a seat he won in 2019, like one of mine, perhaps it really is time for a sea change, because the Labour Party now has a story to tell about the parties, about its own plans for the country, and its own competence, crucially.
One thing that several people have pointed out is obviously Christian Wakeford's defection does mean there's now one letter out of the pot towards the 54 to trigger a vote of no confidence.
Yes, indeed. I have to say that's very well choreographed from the Labour Party. Great deep cover, on a par with Anthony Blunt looking after the Queen's paintings after telling his university secrets to the KGB or whatever. I think it's very, very entertaining deep cover, knowing that Christian Wakeford knew he'd be sat behind Keir Starmer, saying, "Oh, I'm so furious, I'm going to hand him my letter to Graham Brady." Great stuff.
Boris Johnson getting some support and cheers from Conservative MPs sitting behind him, and the Cabinet are out in force. On the front bench, we've got the Chief Whip Mark Spencer, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Dominic Raab and Anne-Marie Trevelyan, and then on his other side, Rishi Sunak, who went missing last week in Devon, then Priti Patel and Sajid Javid. So and Nadine Dorris, I think, is just along the front row as well. So they're all out in force. The one exception being, as we discussed, Liz Truss, who's flown to Australia on a very important visit there. Right, we're going to stick with PMQs and bring you some more of the action from the House of Commons. We're going to hear now from the SNP's leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week was supposed to be Operation Save Big Dog, but it's quickly become Operation Dog's Dinner. Over the past few days, we've had more damaging revelations about Downing Street rule-making, more evidence that Parliament has been misled, and an even longer list of ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous excuses from the Prime Minister. First he claimed there were no parties. Then he wasn't present. Then he admitted he was at them, but he didn't know it was a party. And then, Mr. Speaker, the latest sorry excuse is really the most pathetic of them all. Nobody told me. Nobody told me. Nobody told the Prime Minister he was breaking his own rules. Absolutely pathetic. The Prime Minister, you know, what a look. The Prime Minister laughing once again, laughing at the British public. The Prime Minister is taking the public.
I think, strictly speaking, he's laughing at Ian Blackford.
Nobody believes him. Will the Prime Minister finally take responsibility, resign, go, Prime Minister?
No, Mr. Speaker, but I thank him for his question again, and let me just remind him that there's an inquiry that is due to conclude. I believe he is wrong in what he asserts, Mr. Speaker, but we'll have to wait and see what the inquiry says. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the most important thing from the point of view of the UK government is that we're coming out of the restrictions that we've been in. I'm delighted to see that that's happening in Scotland as well, and that is very largely thanks to the wonderful cooperation that we continue to see across the whole of the UK, that you wouldn't believe it to hear it from him.
That's the most extraordinary claim I've ever heard from Boris Johnson. There's wonderful cooperation between him and Nicola Sturgeon.
God, halfway through that question, I thought to myself, things really must be bad if Ian Blackford is looking like an authoritative and measured parliamentary orator. And then about 5 minutes later, as Boris Johnson nodded his head and giggled at the lengthy oration we got, I realised that nothing has changed, really.
There's something about Ian Blackford's style where he says things that everyone's been saying for a week as if he's just thought of them, and sort of chuckles along to his own material, and then it seems slightly taken aback that everyone's groaning around him. He's like Twitter on a sort of 24-hour delay. Well,
he is, isn't he? But he's sort of quite a useful parliamentary battering ram for the SNP in that respect, because the story they want to tell about Westminster is necessarily a bit reductive, isn't it? That, you know, its culture is rotten and incapable of dealing with the challenges an independent Scotland wants in line with the wishes of the Scottish people. So, you know, oblivious though he is, his audience isn't the likes of you and I, or indeed Boris Johnson. So
just looking at some of the comments that people have posted on the Times Radio YouTube channel, Steve says, in the grand scheme of things, should opposition MPs be wasting time on this rather than world events, cost of living, people's jobs? Would we be in a better place with Starmer? I think not. So let's get some of the backbench contributions now, some of the real-world stuff. Let's hear from Neil Hanvey, a Alba MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowden Heath, asking about COVID contacts after a veteran in his constituency took his own life because of financial debt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the cost of living crisis deepens, this government's priorities get ever more remote from my Kirkcaldy and Cowden Heath constituency. Only this week, I learned a veteran in my constituency, James Scott, took his own life as a result of his struggle with mounting financial pressures. This is a government who are found to have acted unlawfully by the High Court over COVID contracts and now preparing to write off £4.3 billion allocated to those COVID schemes. Why can the UK government find billions of pounds for profiteers and fraudsters, but they can't find compassion to treat the people with dignity, lifting the benefits cap and reinstating the cut to universal credit?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to say how sorry I am for what he's had to say about James Scott, and this government does as much as we can to support veterans, and that's why we published the Veterans Action Plan only the other day, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing is ensuring that we support people throughout this crisis. He mentions, and I've said in my answer to the right honourable gentleman, many of the steps that we're taking to protect people on low incomes, and we will continue to do more, Mr. Speaker. He attacks the contracts for PPE. Actually, I think it was an astonishing thing at great speed to be able to give this country 17 billion items of PPE, thanks to the efforts of people across Whitehall. Mr. Speaker, this country is now capable of producing 80% of our own PPE. Kate Griffiths.
There we are. That was one of the one of the answers from the opposition benches, not specifically on coronavirus and COVID contacts. But Boris Johnson just rattling off the sort of greatest hits. Let's hear now from one of the Conservative MPs. We haven't sort of had an explosion from the backbenches, from the Conservative backbenches. But let's hear now from the Conservative MP for Burton, Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shortly before Christmas, my constituent, Oliver Freckleton, was found at home having been stabbed to death on the eve of his 20th birthday. Yesterday, his heartbroken parents held their son's funeral. Oliver leaves behind a partner and a baby daughter, and 2 teenagers have been arrested for his murder. Now, this tragic event leaves behind a devastated family, friends, and a very worried community. I'm grateful for the work that Staffordshire Police is undertaking to tackle violent crime in my constituency, and the extra 149 additional police officers recruited is very welcome. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that a multi-stakeholder approach is vital to tackling crimes amongst our young people? And what can the government do to support not just the police, but schools, colleges and local authorities in working to address this issue?
My honourable friend, first of all, I'm very sad to hear the news of the loss of her constituent, Oliver. And like so many victims of violent crime, the answer, as is the case with so many victims, the answer is not just policing, though that is vitally important, and that's why we're investing so massively in 20,000 more police officers and supporting them with toughening the law, Mr. Speaker. But it's also, as she rightly says, important to get all the institutions of the state to work together: schools, colleges, the social services and the health service, mental health service as well.
There we are. That's Boris Johnson trying to focus on matters other than his own future. Patrick Maguire, Times Red Box editor.
Well, clearly he has not answered the questions put to him by the Labour Party, and they're also the questions his MPs are asking. Your bell has got to work out today, because ultimately Tory MPs, a critical mass of them, clearly, although we might find out between now and Sue Gray's report that some of them have snapped, are deferring to Sue Gray. And as long as that is the question, as long as that sword of Damocles is hanging over Boris Johnson's head, or neck, as he would say, as that's the original Greek, then we're going to be stuck in this holding pattern. And that last question and answer, Boris Johnson talking about knife crime, that is one of the stories the government wants to tell. That's one of the things it wants to focus on. Remember Crime Week? I'm given to understand there's going to be another one of those soon.
Patrick Maguire, we are talking about Boris Johnson's future because of all the letters supposedly going in just before PMQs. Christian Wakeford, the Conservative MP for Bury South, defected to the Labour Party. In the last few seconds, David Davis has called on Boris Johnson to go. We'll bring you that live in just a moment. This is one of the things we haven't seen so far, is a really big name going after Boris Johnson.
Yes, and a fellow traveller on Brexit. Obviously, David Davis served with Boris Johnson in Theresa May's cabinet, campaigned alongside him in 2017. That is huge. He's certainly the biggest name to have called for him so far, and not a usual suspect, not from the One Nation wing of the party, an ideological fellow traveller.
OK, here it is. This is what David Davis has just said in the last few minutes in the Commons.
Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I've reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Wow. How did Boris Johnson respond?
Order. Prime Minister.
I must say to the right honourable gentleman, I don't know what he's talking about, but what I can tell him, I don't know what quotation he's alluding to that he's referring. But what I can tell him is that I think I've told this House repeatedly throughout this pandemic, I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
Stephen.
Patrick Maguire, in the last few minutes, David Davis, former Brexit secretary, he resigned from Theresa May's cabinet over Brexit. Boris Johnson followed him out not long afterwards. Former leadership candidate, was a whip under John Major during Maastricht. He knows how these things work. He's by far the most senior person so far to call for Boris Johnson to go.
And he's done so not in veiled euphemistic language or in an op-ed, in a broadsheet, but he's done so in the most explosive, and he's knifed him in the front, so to speak. And again, done it in a way that wounded him, although Boris Johnson affected not to know anything about the Norway debate there, which is very unconvincing for a biographer of
Explain for people your knowledge of these things. This was in a debate, this was in the Norway debate in the House of Commons.
Which in 1940, which cemented Neville Chamberlain's fate. It was the moment where it became clear that Neville Chamberlain had lost the support of the House, and it paved the way for Winston Churchill, Boris Johnson's great political idol, to become Prime Minister. So for him to invoke that specific example is a deliberate attempt to goad and wound Boris Johnson. And seeing David Davis and Christian Wakeford bookend this PMQs with calls to the PM to go just shows you the breadth and depth of discontent with Boris Johnson.
Well, if you're just joining us here on Times Radio, it's been quite the morning in Westminster. About just under an hour ago, we got the news that Christian Wakeford, the now former Conservative MP for Bury South, had defected to the Labour Party, telling Boris Johnson that he cares passionately about the people of Bury South, and I've concluded the policies of the Conservative government that you lead are doing nothing to help the people of my constituency, and indeed only making the struggles they face on a daily basis worse. It's set up an extraordinary Prime Minister's questions. Let's take a listen to some of what's gone on. First of all, let's hear from, this is what Keir Starmer had to say about that defection.
Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party.
It's Keir Starmer there gloating about Christian Wakeford defecting from the Conservatives to the Labour Party. Christian Wakeford sitting behind him wearing a Union Jack face mask. Although Nadine Dorries, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, I think, had tweeted saying, sadly, Christian has yet to realise that the Union Jack mask he is wearing to cross the floor to Labour is not welcome on that side of the House. Huge and overwhelming support for Boris Johnson from packed Tory benches, she said. Well, this is how Boris Johnson reacted to the news of that defection at PMQs earlier.
May I say, right honourable gentleman, that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
Big cheers there for Boris Johnson. It should point out that the Conservatives won Bury South by 402 votes.
402 or 420. I can't remember which.
Not many, anyway. So, and it had been Labour since 1997. So that was how PMQs kicked off with Christian Wakeford's defection. But let's be honest, but most people in the country will be saying, less so of David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary, who Boris Johnson tried a couple of times to get into the cabinet without success. This is what David Davis said at the end of PMQs.
Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
This is how Boris Johnson responded.
Order. Prime Minister.
I must say to the right honourable gentleman, I don't know what he's talking about, but what I can tell him, I don't know what quotation he's alluding to that he's referring. But what I can tell him is that I think I've told this House repeatedly throughout this pandemic, I take full responsibility for everything done in this government and throughout the pandemic.
Quite the moment there. Patrick Maguire, Times Red Box editor. Let's wrap up where we are with Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is still on his feet in the House of Commons. He's actually making an announcement about the ending of Plan B coronavirus restrictions, working from home no longer needed, mandatory COVID certification would end, no longer having to wear face masks in classrooms. All of that overshadowed by the extraordinary spectacle of David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary under Theresa May, former Conservative leadership candidate, standing up in the House of Commons, citing, as you point out, Churchillian historical reference to really needle Boris Johnson and calling for Boris Johnson to go. How secure is Boris Johnson this lunchtime?
I hate to use the word febrile, but that's exactly how it feels. After that moment, that David Davis moment, it feels even tenser than it did at the very start of that PMQs. When you have a 2019 intake MP quitting to join the Labour Party and David Davis casting the Prime Minister as Chamberlain in such a way as to humiliate him in front of his own benches. And then you have an announcement on COVID, which might have otherwise been, red meat to backbenchers, that has been completely ignored because the Prime Minister is in such a mess. I struggle to see a way back. It's a very, very narrow path to survival, even narrower than it was last week.
The big unknown, of course, is how many more there are. And as we were discussing, does Christian Wakeford's defection mean that some red wall MPs slightly panic and step back from the brink? How many people does David Davis is a big name. He's a bit of a maverick. How big is his, although he resigned first from Theresa May's cabinet, it was a bigger moment when Boris Johnson did it. How many people do you think he takes with him? Does that outweigh nervousness on the other side?
It's a very good question. And I think certainly to some MPs, both of those moments will have a so what quality to them. MP you've never heard of defects the Labour Party because he's too scared to, last the course of 2024 and see if he can win as a Tory. So what? David Davis, old, irrelevant, never getting back into the cabinet, some MPs might say. So what? But I suspect, particularly with the DD intervention, that is a signal, as you said, for someone who's one of the few people in the Commons who's been here for exactly 3 decades, who's been around the block before, who's seen prime ministers fall, indeed played his part in founding Prime Ministers, someone who believes in Boris Johnson's achievements as Prime Minister. It's quite the moment, and I think that might sway some waverers, particularly of his generation, the few remaining MPs of that intake.
I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? We've now got big beasts who've been in the Commons for 20, 30 years and the 2019ers, and actually does that just create a groundswell?
And it was very easy to dismiss for number 10 if you wanted to. If you're Nadine Dorries, basically say, oh, look at these spoiled brats turning on the man who made them. You can't really say that about David Davis.
You can say what you like about David Davis. He's not an effing nobody, as reported yesterday. Well, blimey, O'Reilly, Patrick Maguire, full exhausted. Thank you so much for joining us once again for PMQ's Unpacked live on YouTube and here on Times Radio. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all of your comments. We'll be back to do the same thing next week. Can it top that? A defection and a former Cabinet Minister calling on the Prime Minister to resign. We'll, of course, keep across all of the fallouts of everything that's been happening in the House of Commons throughout the day. Mariella Frostrup here from 1 o'clock today. John Pino at Times Radio Drive from 4. Phil Williams from 7. And then Carol Walker will be here from 10 o'clock tonight, taking a look at tomorrow's newspapers. Who knows what they're going to say? Who's going to be the top line? Is it Christian Wakeford? Is it David Davis? Will there be someone else by that point? We'll have to wait and see.
Lindsay Hoyle, someone's just texted me to say, caught on his mic at the end of that session saying, what a day. He speaks for the nation.
And nice that Patrick managed to get his impression in there right at the end. Right, thanks so much for that. That was PMQ's Unpacked. We will... let's take a deep breath and we'll do the quiz next.
John Pienaar at Drive this afternoon from